Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and today we're going to be doing a deck creation video. That's right, we don't only critique decks here, we sometimes build them. This is a Necrobloom deck that comes to us from Shirok, who says, looking to have a deck list created for this commander upon the bit of cards already started. Thank you so much in advance. Absolutely, the Necrobloom was definitely a commander that caught my eye, and we'll look into the cards that Shirok sent me in a second, but I had a lot of fun building this deck. I think like Landfall and land decks are sometimes overlooked as being very consistent and powerful, and especially one without blue brings just joy to my heart. Now, Abzan Landfall definitely has some perks and some downsides in those colors versus like Jund or let's say Temur. But here, I think we found some really cool cards, especially using some MH3 cards, building a strong and fun deck. We will get to the list in a second, but first, let's take a look at our commander. If you'd like to take a look at the deck list we're talking about today, or if you'd like to submit your own deck list to me so that I can make a video assisting your deck, please check the video description down below. So who is the Necrobloom, and why are they our Abzan Landfall commander? The Necrobloom is a 2/7 plant in white, black, and green, 4 mana, and they have 2 abilities. The first one is Landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, create a 0/1 green plant creature token, but if you control 7 or more lands with different names, instead you create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. This is almost Field of the Dead, a land that has the second half of this, that if you can, you have 7 or more lands and you get a land enter the battlefield, you get a 2/2, which is already an immensely powerful ability, and now it's attached to your commander. The second ability says land cards in your graveyard have Dredge 2, which means you can return land cards to your hand by instead milling 2 cards off the top of your deck and replacing a draw. This is a really classically powerful effect, though Dredge's ability has often been about that number being very high and not necessarily getting the same card over and over. However, here, every single land gets Dredge 2, allowing us to use very powerful lands and rebuying them very cheaply. So what was my idea building the deck? Let's take a look what Shirok sent me. Shirok sent me a bunch of cards. There's only 2 I didn't use. I switched them around, but otherwise, the deck had a very straightforward plan in my mind. So we have in our lands immensely powerful, oh, I did change Baron more, I will say, but immensely powerful lands, very with Strip Mine, Field of the Dead being a backup, and Wasteland being, Strip Mine and Wasteland specifically being, you know, land hate for your opponents, and Glacial Chasm basically locking down combat against you. So we have a lot of power here. We also have Squandered Resources that will generate us tons of mana. Not Zoran Orb, we had another one, but we'll get to that. Astronaut's Altar that also sacrifices creatures that will make off of Necrobloom. And what are we doing with this mana? It seems to be our win condition is Torment of Hellfire, doing a giant Torment for X being like 18 to 20 and taking out all our opponents at once. We also have a bit of a Blood Artist plan while we're doing those sacrificing, Reassembling Skeleton that comes back, Pitiless Plunderer that benefits from our creatures dying, and Cultivator Colossus as another giant mana generation, land generation, draw card spell. So before we get into it, what are the cards I didn't use? Well, Baron Moor I replaced for the green version of this ability because I think green is just a lot more powerful in this deck and just more accessible. Blood Artist I replaced with Zulaport Cutthroat because it hits all of our opponents instead of just one when something dies. And Bone Miser is the one card I completely took out. And why did I take out Bone Miser? The main reason was that Bone Miser represents a very different kind of plan, and the way I'm looking at it, a very specifically weaker plan than the rest of the deck. Now there's a few things we can do. We can use a certain imp that allows us to discard cards from our hand for black mana, which can be immensely powerful of using the imp. Let me find that imp. So it's Scourge Familiar is the Phyrexian imp that you discard a card, add black mana, and with that, with Bone Miser, if you discard a land, you're basically Dark Ritualing, generating 3 black mana. And I really do like this, and this is a card that's in a lot of like infinite win conditions and other things you can do with it. However, I feel like they're 2 5-mana cards, and Scourge Familiar, like if you want that effect, Scourge Familiar already does this, that you don't really need the Bone Miser, and I didn't find us using any more discard, so I just removed it. If you wanted to keep that and put in Scourge Familiar, I think it would be fine, but having 2 5-mana cards that kind of need each other, well, to be fair, that the Bone Miser needs the Scourge, whereas the Scourge Familiar is just strong, I just didn't find that to be particularly strong in the direction that the deck is going. So what direction did I go in? Well, I tried to support some of the plan by giving a bit of redundancy. I tried to work in a lot of ramp. I tried to work in a lot of different graveyard synergies, especially with our land creatures, and that was my main plan. So I wanted to build a deck that was somewhat a straightforward combo deck with a landfall backup, let's say. So the majority of our deck builds our resources towards a nice mid-game where we have more mana than everyone else, and then we're either using Necrobloom or Field of the Dead to generate tokens upon tokens to provide a nice baseline threat and, sacrifice resources. While on the other hand, what we're really building towards is a lethal Torment of Hailfire or a lethal Exsanguinate. Either of these are very, very accessible for the deck, where we can turn almost all of our resources into mana, support that with a Boseiju who shelters all, which enables for that spell to be uncounterable, and then win from there. So with that in mind, let's go through the deck, because it is a deck tech we're going to go through, and maybe you can tell me what I didn't think of and what could be improved here. So starting through our creatures, I wanted to start with a few 1-mana creatures that I thought were very strong, and Arboreal Grazer is a card that is very strong in Modern, and I think is definitely not... It's kind of underrated in Commander. It is a ramp creature in high land list. It's a land list with 40 lands because we are a landfall deck. I skipped through this. It's a good time. I did put 40 lands in here because we are a landfall deck, and this is the currency of our deck. And for those just like I would, this is our curve, which I think is pretty nice for the deck that aims to ramp quickly. But going back to Arboreal Grazer, not only is it very, very likely for us to have the extra lands to put into play when this creature enters the battlefield, this also functions as another landfall trigger. Now, it doesn't work perfectly because if you put a fetch land tap, that fetch land cannot be cracked right away. So there is a limit to this, but it's still very strong of getting additional landfall trigger very easily and ramping us early game. Not to mention how strong it is with a card like Flare of Cultivation. Moving forward, something else that I also think is very valuable is Arboreal Grazer's ability to block early threats is something that I think is somewhat underrated, especially at mid to high level power decks. The ability to stop, things like Tymna, the ability to stop a few creatures that just would be able to get free hits, free triggers basically, is very, very valuable, and the amount of incidental damage you'll just stop is also very good. That reach is more relevant than you think, and I think there's a lot of points, especially late game, where this will stop. You can chump very well with this to buy yourself another turn. Deathrite Shaman feels almost perfect for a deck that is so dependent or so functional with its graveyard, but of course you can use this on your opponent's graveyards to get a little more value from it. Do note we are mainly using this as a mana dork, but the other two abilities are pretty nice. Elvish Reclaimer is another really good 1-mana elf in the deck, and this is just a crop rotation that requires mana and tapping it. I don't think this is the kind of card you really care to to grow to attack. You're really just using it for the sacrifice ability to get the right lands onto the battlefield. Aftermath Analyst is a card that I'm very impressed with, and I think this is one of two, and I am going to jump around a little bit, one of two splendid reclamation effects. Aftermath Analyst is for sure the better version of the two, because not only does it mill, you can use this at instant speed, but either of these cards are just really, really powerful for taking our very large graveyard and just putting it onto the battlefield. This is a great value play, but can also just potentially get us enough landfall triggers to win the game on the spot. Bloodghast and our Reassembling Skeleton are two of our reanimation targets of creatures that will just keep coming back, triggering mainly our, where are you once again? Insidious Roots to get more plants and allow our plants to tap for mana. I've also put in a Entomb, which is very good with these cards, but also just insane with the deck. There will be a point that you already have like Field of Dead and the other lands you really want to have in your graveyard. So Entomb can be used at this point to grab a Bloodghast, to grab the Reassembling Skeleton, and just have something that while you are playing Landfall triggers to trigger other things, to have another sacrifice outlet and the like. Now, we have Corpse Knight here, which is also my answer to the Blood Artist Zulaport Cutthroat problem, where these cards are very good, don't get me wrong, but one of the things that hold them back is things need to die. And though we do have sack outlets and a very strong one with Ashnod's Altar, I really do prefer to be getting the damage triggers on the ETB. So Corpse Knight is here saying that whenever our plants or zombies come out of our commander, we do get those triggers and start damaging our opponents. The fact that he himself is a zombie, I think, is rather cute. And this is one of those benefits that this is something we can use from white that otherwise we wouldn't be using, and I think that's pretty neat. Moving further on, Dark Confidant as a great draw spell. Deeproot Wayfinder, I think, is very notable here as a creature that early game, 2/3 is a very good body. The Surveil one on hit is great, but the putting a land from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped is very, very powerful. Now, I see this being a card that's good for the first few turns and then otherwise gets kind of tricky. But once again, in higher to mid-level power, a 2/3 is something that's difficult to block. And it's, as long as you're not like setting it at the aggro player or the defensive player, you should be able to get a trigger per turn cycle or a trigger every 2 turn cycles after the initial few turns. I think the initial few turns you're likely to get a trigger very early, which I think pays for this card for sure. Especially just the ability to not even worry about making the Surveil work, having like a turn 1 fetch land, turn 2 this, and then when this hits getting the fetch land back, I think is rather good. Lotus Cobra, obviously a pillar of Landfall, very, very powerful here. Works really well with our finishers by giving us just more mana to dump into them. Sakura Tribe Elder is also a classic ramp deck, very, very strong. I'm trying to keep low amounts of basics coming into play because we are only playing 5 at the time, but between that and Flare of Cultivation, I think it's worth it, and I believe there's also a Fabled Passage that does that. Perhaps if I find one more, it might be worth considering going up a basic, but I think at the moment, those are the only ones we're using, and I think I'm fine with that for sure. Springheart Nantuko is a card that's been just insane in Modern, but I think is just generally good. This card is a little deceptive because we tend to look at its bestow. Like, the way this works is that if you bestow this onto a creature, when a land comes into play, you pay 1 and a green and you get a copy of that creature. And people get stuck on that, but the other half of it is if this creature is bestowed or otherwise and you play a land, you just create a 1/1 green insect. And that by itself is the main way to play this. Like, think about how our commander works. It's just a landfall trigger that makes a 0/1 most of the time and then 2/2s. This is a 2 mana version of that. I think Scoot Swarm is like this as well, but it's 3 mana. I don't think there is a cheaper version than 2 mana to create a 1/1 on landfall, and this is very, very impressive. I didn't put Scoot Swarm in here, but you could if you wanted to, if you want redundancy in the effect. I thought it's just this power level, I'd rather have the Springheart, especially because the Springheart is modular in the sense that late game you attach it to a huge creature and you take advantage of that instead. So very, very good here. White of the Reliquary, yet another MH3 card that feels very, very strong. I believe we also have Knight of the Reliquary. These two cards work very, very similarly, where we are sacrificing something to get lands on the battlefield. Between the two, obviously White of the Reliquary is much stronger because it allows us to trade our creature, especially our tokens, for lands on the battlefield. But we are in Abzan, we get to play both. I think you play both. They're both very, very strong, and once again, the ability to find and play Field of the Dead every time is going to be very, very strong. Do note that with Knight of the Reliquary's need to sacrifice a forest for the plains, and then you're getting a colorless land, we might be cutting ourselves off colors if we're not smart, so be careful when you use that, but very, very powerful combination. Dryad of the Elysian Grove, just a card that continues to be incredibly powerful in any form of land deck, fixes your mana, gives you extra land drops. I think you're always happy with this card. Eternal Witness, green staple, you don't need me to explain what it is, fantastic. Six is another very strong MH3 card, possibly one of the strongest in a deck like this. Just immensely powerful to not only return lands from your graveyard to your hand, but also just the ability to have retrace on your permanents. So these won't cast the instants or sorceries, but I think you're fine with that because the rest of your cards are just very, very good. Unfortunately, you cannot, cast a land. It even says non-land permanents, just in case you didn't know how retrace works. That's the one downside of this, but I think its strength is rather good. Once again, a 2/4 reach is a very reasonable body, and at a certain point, you're not attacking with 6, even though it has this main ability. You're just using that second ability to rebuy certain cards. And honestly, thinking about like discarding a card to get a Sakura Tribe Elder for another Landfall trigger, or discarding it to get another Arboreal Grazer trigger, right? I think that's really, really rather good by casting these cards out. And obviously with the sack outlet, they get even better. Springbloom Druid is, I guess this is the last basic. So I think I would cut this. Now I'm like in the process of looking at it. I think we have too many basic cards. This ability is just very uniquely strong here. It's like Harrow, but it is specifically on a creature. So it helps both sides of our deck. So maybe it's fine, because the odds of drawing all of our basic land enablers are low. But even with that in mind, maybe I would trade one of these for something else. Still very, very strong, allows us to ramp, puts a land into our graveyard, which is something we really want as we can put it back on the battlefield. Just generally very happy. Looking at our 4-drops in our creatures, Blossoming Tortoise is a card I've been looking at for a very long time, and it feels like it's always been just almost playable in a lot of formats, and this is the kind of deck that absolutely loves this. I don't think you particularly care about the second ability that much. It is that first ability you really like to just constantly, not only is it a Titan, but you're just putting lands into the battlefield turn after turn. I wish it wasn't a 3/3, and this last ability also just does not matter. So with that in mind, I think very, very fun card. I think you're really just using this first kind of text. Pitiless Plunderer is of course one of our combo cards and one of the cards we've been gifted to build the deck around. I think it's just strong by itself. Your opponents will need to block your torrent of 2/2 zombies or all of your other very powerful attacking creatures. So giving them, like, we don't really need to build too far into this. It's also really nice that after a board clear, we basically untap with a ton of treasure, and that's really, really nice. Thalion the Gitrog monster is like the other landfall deck in Abzan, I find, and this is a very, very strong card. All of this works really, really well. You get extra lands, your opponent's creatures and non-basics come in tapped, and then when it attacks, you sacrifice a creature, most likely a token, and draw a card. Not even, mentioning the 4/4 First Strike Death Touch is an incredibly powerful stat line on a creature that's just a beast for sure. So I think this is almost free to play in this deck, and in certain circles, this could be an alternative commander. Not in this build, but definitely I can see it. Something I think is the best sacrifice payoff or the best Blood Artist effect in this deck, Mazarek Crawl Death Priest is stupid good. This is a card that basically boosts all of our tokens and all of our creatures every time a permanent sacrifice. And as you know, we're playing fetch lands, we're playing cards that are sacrificing lands. We have a lot of ways to get this from like just a 2/2 into like an 8/8, and all of our creatures will get +6/+6 as well. So immensely powerful card, and I think this is one of our really nice finishers, which I should say we are in finisher realm for sure. Titania is another finisher that I think is very, very accessible. Just works kind of differently from Mazarek. Instead of growing the board you have, Titania gives you creatures as you sacrifice lands, and has an ETB, which I think is much stronger, of getting a land back onto the battlefield. I think people who haven't played against Titania in these kind of setups really probably underestimate how quickly she makes she just goes nuts and makes the game unwinnable, as I think it's pretty reasonable for her to generate 3 to 4 5/3s in a turn or two. And I think if you set up for her, it's like a lethal attack the next turn, which I really like. The only 5-drop that I think is more setup than payoff, Underrealm Lich. This is a card I've always liked, and I think this is a very nice place to have this. It turns your card draw into Ransack the Lab, which is really powerful. And there's a lot of ways to kind of maximize that card draw, but Underrealm Lich just staying around and letting you draw the top 3 or from the top 3 every time is very powerful. We're pretty good on defense, so that 4 life to keep it around I think is very accessible to us. Just a fun card that I think fits in here. I think if you really wanted to, this would be a card you could cut because there's definitely more powerful, like, alternative options. Cultivator Colossus, obviously very strong here. Moonshaker Cavalry is kind of the fun one that I want to put in here. I think any of those really big smash face cards are going to be better, but Moonshaker Cavalry is a lot of fun, and I think it's very notable here because giving flying to our creatures is something that's very powerful here because our creatures are very small to begin with, so trample is worse than flying. Granted, the way we use these finishers is that we have enough creatures that it's lethal no matter what. Still, I think this is a little more fun. It is very white pipped, but in this deck you should be able to make it. Once again, I think this could easily be cut, but I think it is a fun inclusion. The one that's a little more interesting to me is Rumbleweed, a card that I didn't even think of or see from the Outlaws Commander deck. This is just very accessible, that when it enters the battlefield, it still gives that overrun effect. It doesn't gain haste, but stays around as a 8/8 Vigilance Reach Trample, which is really strong, and I think very accessible for the deck. Like, getting 10 lands into the graveyard is very reasonable if you're just occasionally milling yourself, and since some of our payoffs are like Splendid Wreck and Aftermath Analyst, there's a lot to go towards that direction. So being able to cast out the Rumbleweed for like 2 or 3 mana, I think is going to be something that's real and accessible. Let's take a look at our sorceries. A lot of these are more interaction in our sorceries and instants, and I think they're very powerful, so we'll probably go through these quickly. Pick Your Poison is a fantastic interaction spell in Commander, and I really recommend, if you don't have your copies, pick them up. They've dropped a little in price, but they'll probably keep that price because they're very powerful. So if you ever have a chance to pick some up, I do recommend it. Unearth, I really like this here because of the sheer number of powerful 3-drops and below that we have. I don't think it's the most necessary one, but being able to buy back any of these cards, especially things like White or the Dryad of the Elysian Grove, I think it's going to be, or 6 even, it's going to be very worthwhile. And so I really want to play this card, even though at times it's just going to be dead. And if it is dead, we have cycling. Extenuate, as mentioned before, is a second copy of Torment. I just think it's worth it because our smart opponents will learn how we're going to defeat them and be able to play around, make sure you don't have the Torment. So having the Extenuate as a secondary spell you can cast, I think is going to be worth it. Obviously, it's less powerful, but we do what we can. Life from the Loam is such a powerful card and just belongs in this deck. Returning lands, dredging, overall just a wonderful package. I love this card very much, and I think it is great here. Pillage the Bog also is a very powerful card of its ability to basically tutor through your deck at a certain level, which I would just say mid-game. Mid-game, you should be able to have like 12 plus lands, and you're looking at, 24 cards. I guess that's not half your deck, but a quarter to a third, depending on how much you've drawn, and I think that's very reasonable for 2 mana. Should this instead just be Demonic Tutor? Probably, but this is fun and accessible for more players. Flare we've gone over, Splendid Wreck we've gone over. In our instance, Crop Rotation is just like the poster child of this deck. It's so powerful in so many ways, and it's always cheaper than I think it is, so definitely pick up your copy and use it here. Once again, Field of the Dead is really good, but also being able to grab the Glacial Chasm and just stopping like an attack before it happens, or when you are attacked or trying to be burned out of the game. Putting this into play in response, you're going down 2 lands, unfortunately, but still really, really powerful to negate, to basically use a fog, and then the turn after, you just let it go to the graveyard because you don't particularly mind, is very, very good. Dark Ritual, still think this is always good. This is a card that I do particularly always love. I think, sorry, I'm going to switch the printing while we're here. I think it's just, here we have less cards that we want to just, like Necropotence, for example, to pump out on the 3rd turn, or on the 1st turn, I should say. But this does ramp us into a lot of really good options, or give us just a little more mana to get to where we want to be. And I really do enjoy that. We can even just use this to like ramp into Smothering Tithe, which I think is good enough. Entomb, mentioned before, very strong. Nature's Claim is a card I absolutely love. I really recommend to people who do not consider this card good to consider it as very powerful. We play things like, you know, Generous Gift, and you'll see Beast Within because they're so strong and hit everything, but traditionally we use them on non-creatures because we have other options like Swords of Plowshares, Path to Exile that are much more powerful. So here, think about this in reverse. This is a 1 mana card that hits almost all non-creature permanents that aren't lands, and I think you're going to be really, really happy with the result. The ability to deal with things like Ristic, deal with things like the Smothering Tides and the like really neatly is going to be worthwhile, and that 4 life doesn't matter to you. Obviously, we're playing Path. Revitalizing Repast is really good, and I think it's nice that it protects your commander, but it is MDFC, so half the time you will be playing it from your hand just as a tapped card. But I think it's also very reasonable to protect your commander from a board wipe or something like that, and I think you'll be happy having access to this. Swords of Plowshares, removal. Grisly Salvage feels really in tune of our ability to put lands in our graveyard and pull lands out of the top 5. Rite of Harmony really caught my eye. This is the card that I think is definitely the reason we should be in white. The ability to play Rite of Harmony or flash it back and then just have a turn where we're playing lands, we're fetching, we're casting spells that get us more lands, we're casting creatures to get us more lands, and every single one of those lands generating a creature off our commander to draw us more cards. This is going to be a 2 mana draw 4, maybe draw 5, very reasonably, and I really do like it. And later in the game, 4 mana to do that is also very good. And then of course, the flashback ability, so we don't mind if we throw it in the graveyard, is really, really nice. Beast Within, I was thinking about Stroke of Midnight, but obviously we're more green and black than we are white, so the mana works better. But if I've ever had to explain to someone why I like Generous Gift or Beast Within more than Stroke of Midnight, you can look at this deck. Think of how important it is to use Beast Within on, for example, Field of the Dead. Now granted, this deck is very, very resilient to that, but still its ability to stop Field of the Dead 1 turn where you can or Necrobloom when your opponent casts Splendid Wreck and you have priority to then Beast Within the land out of the game is going to be very, very important. So I really like this here. This is a deck that's like a lot weaker to graveyard hate than it is for targeted removal, but still its ability, like this card is good against the deck, but this deck also wants it for the exact same reasons. Finally, Rowan's Grim Search. As always, if we are generating tokens, if we care about our graveyard, and obviously card draw, this is a very, very good card in this deck, and I think you're going to be very, very happy with it. Looking at our artifacts, Zeron Orb, I found another copy of that, we'll get to that in a bit. Skull Clamp, both of these cards came with the deck, very good. Soul Ring, Ashnod's Altar. The only one I added, well, Soul Ring wasn't in the original list, but we know Soul Ring's in every deck. Conduit of Worlds feels very, very strong here. Once again, it's a 4 mana spell that kind of competes with our commander, but I think this is definitely worth it. Being able to play lands from your graveyard is great, but also to occasionally reanimate a card is very, very good. This is a very big cost in a deck like this, but like don't just look at this and be like, oh, okay, this is going to take my whole turn. You are playing Conduit of Worlds for this ability primarily, but this is gravy. There's a reason I'm not using Crucible of Worlds, because I think that ability just by itself, the first one, is not good enough. And I guess you should play Crucible too. Maybe play Crucible, but I think it's just barely not good enough, but putting these two together is very, very strong. Is Crucible an affordable card? It is $24. All right, I'll leave it up to you. Going into enchantments, Insidious Roots was already in the deck. I think it's very, very strong. I think this first half is actually just good enough. I think that second half is fine, but generally you're just happy for your creature tokens to tap. And then this ability is very, very reasonable with not just Bloodghast and the Reassembling Skeleton, but also with Dryad Arbor, which this deck has a very good time putting into the graveyard and playing it from the graveyard repeatedly. Or removing it, right? You can just retrace it to get an additional trigger off of Insidious Roots. Squandered Resources, also very accessible. Aura Shards, I think, is very, very strong in this deck. The ability that every time it basically reads Landfall, blow up an artifact or enchantment is going to get you out of a lot of pickles, and will also buy you some political power if you can make some deals with it. It's a very, very strong card in this deck and should not be ignored. Necropotence is here because it is very, very good draw. Do note this: discard a card, exile that card from your graveyard is going to bite you in the butt sometimes, but there's going to be situations where you just don't care, where you just need to refill your hand completely and then hopefully win on the next turn. Overgrown Estate is our other Zoran Orb, which notably can only be played in these colors, and I think is very, very powerful. Both these cards are just methods of putting lands into your graveyard from the battlefield, and there's a lot of payoffs for that, but having 2 copies of this, I think, is absolutely worthwhile. Now, don't get me wrong, a Zoran Orb can also be, like, fetched from Urza's Saga very, very easily, but I just like having a bit of this redundancy because this ability, like being able to go Overgrown Estate, cast Splendid Wreck, hold priority, sacrifice all of your lands, and then put your all the lands you already had and all the lands in your graveyard back on the battlefield again is just so powerful that I do want multiple versions of this ability. It's just such a stupid way to win the game, and there's so many like benefits to it. Speaking of which, I wanted one more kind of landfall pressure card because our deck is a pressure deck. We do win off of like a very, very strong Torment, but sometimes we do need to drain our opponents out, especially if we're going to the token pressure angle. And Retreat to Hargra's, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life per landfall, I think is still really very much so worth playing. I do get it is a weaker card in a vacuum, but in a deck like this, it just naturally just represents so much damage. And if you're unsure, I would play with this and then count how much damage you can do with it. And I think you'll be convinced that it's very, very strong. Finally, Smothering Tithe is our last enchantment, and I don't think I really need to explain why that's good. 40 lands, 40 great lands. I don't want to go too much through them. Bojuka Bog is both, once again, very powerful against this deck, but very powerful in this deck. Just immensely powerful card. If you are in black, it's basically free to play. We are playing the Surveil lands. We're playing the multiple player lands. I actually don't know what those are called. We are playing, we said the Surveil lands, Shock lands. We're playing I believe every green fetch we have access to, plus the on-color fetches. I'm gonna leave that to you, how much you want to put fetch lands. I understood this as a deck that is running Wasteland and Strip Mine, and also where is our Glacial Chasm? I guess Glacial Chasm's not as expensive as I think it is, but a lot of these cards already had like a price to them, so I was assuming this deck is being proxied or not. If you cannot afford fetch lands, this deck does get weaker, but I will say it's fine generally. You just wanted to play more cards that will fetch into basics and more basics, because the ability to put these cards into your graveyard I think is really, really important. We did get a few cards recently. There's the fetch lands from the newest set MH3. There's also the pseudo fetch lands from New Capenna. Those are very cheap alternatives. Obviously, Terramorphic Expanse, Evolving Wilds, these will work too. They're not ideal, but the need to put lands in your graveyards is really, really high, so I do think you should run them. But if you are doing proxies, you should definitely play every fetch you can so that you can fetch the cards you want. The Surveil lands themselves being very, very powerful here and very much so worth playing. We have here also Takenuma. Takenuma is very, very good. Thespian Stage, I didn't put Dark Depths. You can put Dark Depths, I'll leave it to you. I don't particularly like Dark Depths in the current setup of Commander, but it is really powerful when your opponents can't stop a 20/20 indestructible flyer. But a lot of the times your opponents can, so I'll leave that up to you. Once again, I believe it is an expensive card, even if it just did get... Oh, okay, no, not that expensive, so I'll leave that up to you. But yes, Takenuma is very, very good. Thespian Stage is great. I put in both Urborg and Yavimaya because they're basically free. Urza's Cave, likewise, I think is very, very good here. Not only being able to play it out of your graveyard or return it out of your graveyard, and then, you know, use it right away for basically 4 mana to get another land. Like, very, very strong, and I think you're going to very much so enjoy that, and $4 isn't bad. Urza's Saga obviously is probably one of our more expensive lands, but I think it's worth playing if you can, and if you can proxy it. And I think that's generally it. That's the deck. I hope this is the direction you wanted to have it in. Like I said, I couldn't really find a place for Bone Miser, and I did change a few. I know there is a version of the deck where we play this more like what I would say Abzan Aristocrats Reanimator, where the main purpose is we're using landfall triggers to get bodies, whether it be just, you know, tokens off Necrobloom, or, you know, reanimating cards such as Bloodghast, such as Reassembling Skeleton, and a bunch of other like low mana creatures. If you've seen my Ashnod deck on NTG Mudsta, where we're trying to like reanimate all these skeletons that are very, very low mana, there is a version of this deck that can be like this, but I think that's I don't think that's the version this deck wants to be in. Not only does the Necrobloom already do all of that, but better, and I think we just need Reassembling Skeleton and Bloodghast to make up for it. Like, those two will support it fine. I also think that we have to take out a lot of the more powerful cards. We have to kind of weaken the deck purposely to maintain that kind of structure and that power level, so our deck isn't just, you know, kind of lopsided, of having kind of a very fair strategy that out of nowhere Ashnod Altar into Torment of Hellfire and wins the game. I don't think your opponents would appreciate that at the power level the deck was representing. So this, I believe it has a much higher power level and much more stable power level. I will say before we're done here that if you want to increase power level, more tutors, more fast mana. If you want to decrease power level, take out the fetches, take out what tutors we have with Crop Rotation and Tomb. And even then you'll probably have to take down the power level of some of these cards here, because the power level of the deck is high, so it takes a lot of work to bring it down, but it is very doable. I really like the Necrobloom. I think this commander is a lot of fun. Thank you so much, Shirok, for supporting the channel and sending in this request. I had a lot of fun. Necrobloom's great. If you, the viewer, you know, you're interested in having a deck built, you can send me an email on the email that's provided on the channel. I don't understand how YouTube works. Send me a message and we can talk. We can find out exactly what you want to build, and we can build that. That's it for me today. Good luck and happy deck building. Thank you so much for watching. This video is brought to you by viewers like you and people on my Patreon. If you'd like to send me another draft of this deck, or any deck, there is a link in the video description down below. And if you'd like to make your deck one of my donation decks I work on, there's a link there too. Finally, if you'd like to like, comment, subscribe, I would be very appreciative. It helps the channel quite a bit. Thank you and good luck in brewing and building.